All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining ConservAmerica's webinar on reconciliation in America's energy competitiveness. It feels like a pretty busy day here in Washington when it comes to energy, and it's been a busy few years, honestly, but a lot is coming to the head at the moment right now. Just a couple of years ago in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. It was the largest climate bill in history, in US and global history. At the same year, Russia's invasion of Ukraine really elevated the issue of energy security in the US and around the world. More recently, President Trump's return to the White House has brought around really a reset to the global trading system and the announcement of new tariffs. And he's also prioritized the issue of energy dominance. So there's a lot going on in the energy space, and really our goal today is to break down some of the key themes with two fantastic experts. Unfortunately, Nico Ketty of Congressman Garbarino's office had a last-minute conflict and was not able to join, so he sends his apologies. As many of you know, Congressman Garbarino has really been in the thick of the fight to protect some of the energy tax credits that were established over the last few years. Last August, he led a letter with 19 House Republicans and more recently a letter with 21 House Republicans, kind of discussing or making the point that it's important to have business continuity when it comes to a lot of these energy tax credits. But I'm so excited to have Sam Newell of the Brattle Group. He's a principal with the Brattle Group, and he also led a report that ConservAmerica collaborated with Brattle on, and he's going to be talking a bit about that today. So, Sam, really good to have you here today.
Good to be here. Thank you.
And then we also have Rachel Fox, who is the director of policy and strategy with the American Petroleum Institute. And so she is obviously in the thick of the energy industry, and in particular has been quite focused on hydrogen, which I think is an interesting topic that's quite relevant at the moment. So we're going to get her perspective both on the sort of advocacy efforts that are going on at the moment around the Hill, but then also when it comes to hydrogen in particular. So with that, Rachel, I just want to start by asking you. So I believe it was yesterday that the House passed the resolution. And we are now sort of in the thick of negotiations about the future of these tax credits. I guess could we just start by kind of getting a pulse for what is going on the Hill right now from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is such a fascinating time because the last several years have really, we've seen so much momentum in the hydrogen space as a response of the 45V tax credit being created in 2022. And now with this budget reconciliation process, really turning to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that is retiring this year. And to try to fulfill the extension of that, that means that there is a lot of looking around the table for offsets. And that is why 45V is now kind of squarely in a little bit of the eye of the storm, with some other credits also being looked at really closely. But really the key thing here is 45V is a new tax credit. It's novel, created in 2022, unlike 45Q, which has a little bit more history there. But we really see this as sort of like the moment for all of us within industry and within adjacent industries that want to be producers of hydrogen, users of hydrogen, and really see alignment with the American energy dominance agenda here to be champions for this, because this is the time to ensure that those arguments are being received by those that could have the power to really preserve potentially a generational opportunity to invest in low carbon hydrogen production here in the US rather than seeding it abroad.
Absolutely. So a critical moment for API, and I'm sure
Yeah.
for many of your members. Um, I want to zoom out though, and Sam, I want to ask you a bit about the report that Brattle conducted and produced in the last couple of months. And there's for the last several years, there's been a big focus on climate mitigation and energy security. Renewables for climate mitigation, fossil for energy security. But I think there's been a new story that has sort of emerged more recently, and that's around power demand growth, driven by AI and a number of other drivers as well. So I just want to start by asking you, why has that story emerged, and what are some of the primary drivers of demand growth?
First of all, you're right. Every discussion about electricity right now is about the unprecedented demand growth. And that's driven primarily by the rapid emergence of data center demand for AI. There are other drivers too: reshoring of manufacturing, electrification of vehicles, buildings, industry, oil and gas production, um, hydrogen, but the biggest and fastest growing is data centers. And that's also come as a surprise, which has made it challenging for the electric sector to respond quickly enough with enough supply chain for generation, being able to connect by transmission quickly enough.
Absolutely. And so I guess, Sam, the next question I want to ask you, there's been a lot of different organizations, a lot of different companies trying to model this demand growth, and there are all sorts of numbers that we see out there. Could you talk a little bit about the numbers that you came to over the next 5, 10 years, and how those compare to some of the other numbers that we're hearing when it comes to demand growth, both nationally in the US, but also regionally as well?
Our focus was on the impact of the tax credits. We did not we didn't do our own fundamentals based demand forecast. It would be very hard to do that accurately. What we did is we did a roll up of every individual utility's own forecast and of the um, regional forecasts from independent system operators. When you take all of those and add them together, you get an astonishing number of about 20% uh, growth in peak load, which requires having more capital, more capacity to serve it by 2030, almost a 50% increase in electric energy by 2035. Um, other forecasts that have had a similar approach are similar, but the ours is more up to date than some of the others, and so it's bigger because almost all the forecasts have been increasing.
Right. And so Sam, the story is that this, we're going to need a lot more power in the coming years, but you do hone in on some particular tax credits in the study that you conducted, and that was the tech neutral ITC and PTC. Can you talk about the significance of those tax credits in the context of demand growth, but then also in this discussion that Rachel was touching upon around the future of the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits?
Yeah, the analysis that we did looked at what is the least cost way to meet electric demand over the next 10, 15 years. And we followed fairly standard approaches for modeling that, for modeling investment in electric generation capacity and the use of electric generation hour by hour to meet demand. And our analysis accounts for the fact that with the tax credits, it costs less to build the wind and solar generation and storage than without.
Absolutely. So, Rachel, I want to turn now to hydrogen because it's a little bit different than when we're talking about solar and wind in the context of ITC and PTC. Uh, Also, zooming out a bit, can you just talk about the use cases for hydrogen and why this is relevant in the conversation right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think even zooming out slightly further, it's even just kind of what does the project pipeline look like for supply? I think that, despite maybe some slow rollout of the 45V guidance, we still do see project announcements that have been made. I think it was, 26% increase in project announcements last year. A lot of that, though, has been trapped in the early stage project development cycle of, FIDs are few and far between right now. And I think that kind of weaves in a little bit to, what applications, where is demand showing up? And that is really sort of, primarily in two kind of key ways that we look at this. First movers, obviously refineries are already using hydrogen. This is an incumbent demand opportunity here. We know that refineries use it to desulfurize diesel. It's really kind of a cleaning agent in a number of different areas within the refinery operation process. There's also, obviously ammonia, fertilizer, heavy industry. I've always thought hydrogen was really unique in the sense that it's really one of the only kind of low carbon molecules that you can use in thermal generation. So that unlocks so many opportunities where electrification just like simply, has a really hard time doing the same thing from a low carbon perspective. And so that's one camp is obviously those first movers. Then you kind of move into the long haul transport, shipping, power generation. I think that another interesting element of this is really just sort of looking at it through the lens of where we're seeing a carve out between the types of hydrogen building potentially market share. So with reformation-based technologies that's using natural gas with carbon capture, we really see a bit of a carve out more with industrial processes in the chemical space as being really where high volume, low carbon blue hydrogen will probably build out a lot of market share. Whereas on the electrolytic green hydrogen side, we see a little bit more of projects trending towards sustainable aviation fuel and transport applications, primarily where you have low carbon, like LCFS type structures in states like Illinois. We see a little bit of a pull on the green hydrogen side there. So I think it's not quite where is hydrogen? What are the end use cases anymore? It's where are the specific end use cases for types of hydrogen, which is an unfortunate conversation to be in when you have states building out policies on green hydrogen versus blue, when we all want it to just be low carbon hydrogen based off of carbon intensity. But I think that's sort of indicative of a bit of where the conversation still is. We have a long way to go on just educating on hydrogen. And then thirdly, I think that there's also, maybe this is slightly different than end use cases, but we're seeing a tremendous uptick in exporting hydrogen as a potential business opportunity. I think at this point, we've already seen a lot of draw away from other end uses of hydrogen to the export model as ammonia. And so increasingly interest from, Japan, South Korea, potentially even some softening in Europe about the carbon intensity, maybe not threshold, but willingness to entertain the idea of what harmonization would look like from a policy perspective there. So I think given the early stage of where the hydrogen market is, it's interesting to kind of see the nuance of where some of these markets may carve out depending on how the hydrogen is produced.
And I imagine one of the questions that lawmakers are asking right now, or one of the critiques that some have as they're looking through the different provisions within the IRA is this a technology that, if not for government policy, would not exist? And so you touched on the global market. I guess could you mentioned ammonia and the opportunity. Could you talk a little bit more about the global market? Because I think this is where it ties into this, how it might relate to the energy dominance agenda and
Yeah.
how the US can be competitive in this technology.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the 45V tax credit, without doubt, makes the United States the most competitive place to produce hydrogen in the world. We also, just putting 45V aside, we are blessed with abundant resources here. We have more than enough natural gas. We have plenty of wind and solar from that perspective as well. So we really see this as, especially from the oil and gas perspective, a core competency. This is something we've already been doing for decades. We already produce a tremendous amount of hydrogen, 9 to 10 million metric tons a year. We already transport it via a pipeline network within the Gulf that we would, want to see expanded, obviously, but we have infrastructure in place here. We know how to move this molecule, this extremely tiny molecule, and it's really only kind of, the pipeline operators that know how to do that. And then thirdly, we have just such an advantageous opportunity with this credit. And I think that we are kind of seeing this as a window of opportunity to jumpstart something with the hydrogen hubs program as well, which, I understand there's uncertainty kind of around what will the future of those projects be. But I think that when we're talking about the export opportunity, we really do hold the cards in terms of producing hydrogen at the lowest costs anywhere in the world, even, putting aside the 45V credit.
Right.
So just trying to imagine long term where this goes. I think we've all seen around, our various policy wonky spaces. When the US cedes our leadership on issues, it's really hard to claw back that leadership later when technology advances, maybe in China or in Europe, and supply chains are built out for wind turbines. We want to make sure that we're running with this momentum now because it may be harder to kind of seize back this leadership down the road.
Right. I mean, this is certainly a story that we've all heard around EVs and solar technology that China got the jump on this, and we see the results of that today. I guess I want to turn back to Sam in a second, but Rachel, you've mentioned 45V a couple of times. Just for those who are not familiar with the mechanics of the credit, would you mind just briefly going over that and
Yeah.
then decoding the blue, green, the different
Oh,
colors of
yeah,
the rainbow and why
absolutely.
that's relevant right now?
Yeah, so the 45V tax credit, hydrogen production tax credit, I think it's always fascinating to view really intricate hydrogen and energy policy through a tax lens because then you have to apply such a different layer of reasoning, given that Treasury is the one that delivers this tax credit or implements it and guides kind of how industry complies. But it's really a cool example of an energy credit designed around carbon intensity, which means You produce a certain volume of hydrogen, and you have to do a little bit of a backwards looking analysis of all of the carbon inputs that went into the production of that. So carbon intensity is a metric of how much carbon is emitted in the process of producing 1 kilogram of hydrogen. And based off of that calculation, you receive via this tax credit through a tiered system. Your volumes fall within a certain tier, and you can hit up to $3 a kilogram if you hit under 0.45 kilograms of CO2 produced in the production process of 1 kilogram of hydrogen. Or from there, it goes down to 75 or $1 to 75 cents to 60 cents. So there's a lot of incentive to try to hit that $3 mark by getting your
Mhm.
hydrogen production produced at a really, really low carbon intensity limit. And so it's really kind of galvanized a ton of innovation and a ton of new ideas as well of how that can be done throughout the natural gas system by lowering the methane intensity of natural gas production or sourcing really, really low methane intensity natural gas, which we love because this means that the 45V tax credit could actually be galvanizing a wholesale shift from, maybe higher emitting natural gas resources to really low emitting natural gas resources. So a lot more tightening up along the value chain there potentially is what the 45V credit could induce. And I think similarly, there's obviously been huge debates on the green hydrogen side for electrolytic hydrogen, which uses wind, solar, potentially some other renewables as well to try to hit near zero or zero emissions in the life cycle of producing those hydrogen volumes through an electrolyzer.
So
Those
there's a lot of
conversations are
different
more
potential pathways
complicated.
for having a strong
Yeah,
play a strong role in this industry, but there needs to be I hear what you're saying is there
are
needs
some
to
guardrails, yeah.
yeah,
And
right.
I think those are right, those rightfully exist. You don't want to see emissions go up more than, what the intent of this is, which is to create hydrogen that would reduce emissions by displacing, dirtier fuel sources. So you can't, have hydrogen that is produced in a very, high emitting way, obviously. But those are primarily the two types of hydrogen. We really focus primarily at API on reformation-based technologies, just given, the inherent technology that we work with. But I will be remiss if I didn't say that several of our members are also interested in electrolytic hydrogen and have projects underway on those. Yeah.
Right, right. Thanks, Rachel. That's super, super helpful. So Sam, I want to turn back to you and the study that you conducted. One of the things that stood out to me was the regional variability of the impact of rolling back the tech neutral ITC and PTC. I think there's a general understanding that different parts of the country produce energy in different ways. Different parts of the country are benefiting from energy tax credits in different ways. I guess could you dive into that a little bit deeper, both about like the regional benefits, but the potential regional downsides when it comes to changing these energy tax credits.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I wonder, might it be helpful if I give a more national view first before
Sure. Yeah,
disaggregating?
absolutely.
Okay. So we just heard from Rachel about the importance of the hydrogen tax credit for promoting an internationally competitive hydrogen industry. I'm going to talk about the effects on having competitiveness in AI and in the economy more broadly. Remember, what we studied was the next 15 years of the electric system with the tax credits for wind, solar, and storage versus without, all else equal. And there are two biggest observations. One is that with this unprecedented demand growth for electricity, it's going to be very hard to meet that. And we need all sources. We need a wide variety of sources in order to meet that. And actually, wind, solar, and storage are the furthest along in development. And so undermining their economics at this moment would be risky for having enough total supply. We'll build out at gas-fired too as quickly as we can, but that's limited. After years of not having very rapid growth, and that we just don't have the supply chains for the large gas turbines that those depend on. So
Sam, that's because we're hearing about order books being filled up through 2028, 2029 from the main producers of those turbines. Is that
yeah,
right?
yeah, and planning to expand production capacity
Right.
of those turbines, and we accounted for that, but it's still enough to meet only something like a third of the demand growth through 2030. So you need a lot of other sources. So that's the first observation. And these industries, data centers, manufacture, they depend on having access to electricity. And so I think there's a risk of undermining that. The second big observation is that the tax credits affect ultimate customer rates. We've had in this country some increases in electricity rates that and you increasingly hear about concerns about affordability of energy, and that's for individuals as well as for industries to be competitive. And at that time, this is a factor that if you took these away, the tax credits away, you would see higher customer costs. I mean that's partly because the customers ultimately get the benefit of the tax credit, and so either they build it anyway and just have to do it at much higher cost,
Mhm.
or they have to build something else that you know, maybe isn't as costly as paying for the whole thing without the credit, for all the wind and solar without the credit, but it's still costlier than what they're doing now. So we modeled what would happen to total electricity supply costs and to customer rates throughout the country. And just to, I mean, sort of the total electric supply cost to the generation, not the wires part of the bill, would increase by about 14% by 2035 without the tax credits, and customer bills would go up by, so if you look at a residential customer, their annual bill would go up about a little over $80 by 2035. In the windy Great Plains states, over $150 per residential customer. And by the way, I think I might have mentioned one of the other studies, or can't remember if I mentioned this, one of the other studies that came out about the same time as ours found even larger impacts on customer
Mm.
bills. Um, so those are, and we can talk about then there are broader economic impacts too, because when people are having to spend more on electric, they spend less on other things. When employers are spending more on electric, they have spent less to spend on wages. We've got $250 billion worth of less capital in wind and solar getting built, and construction and manufacturing output and jobs associated with that. So there are a lot of impacts.
Sam, just
Uh,
out of curiosity, you mentioned the residential price impact.
yeah,
Obviously, it was both the goal of the Biden administration to reshore manufacturing, and certainly now the Trump administration is very focused on restarting American industry and manufacturing as well. Yeah, what are the implications there when it comes to that project that is, seems to be a priority of both Democrats and Republicans at the moment?
yeah, it's both having having access to electricity and having it at a reasonable cost.
Mhm.
Those are both important. We made sort of an optimistic assumption in the study that demand would stay the same either way. That is quite optimistic if because we actually assumed a lot of these projects would still get built even if they've lost the credit. Now, again, I think assuming that electricity prices can rise and rates rise and people pay them, and the new customers still enter, that's a good assumption, but it is optimistic.
Absolutely.
And I'd be
Uh,
happy to touch on the regional impacts if that's still
yeah,
that's
yeah. Please,
yeah.
please do.
So it's really interesting. We ran a model of the whole country, and it accounts for the very different resource endowments in different places. Some places have, the Great Plains have really good wind. The South has really good solar. A number of regions of the country have particularly low cost gas. And it accounts for all that. It accounts for the intermittency of wind and solar, and that and the role of storage and to help meet that, the role of dispatchable gas fired to reliably meet supply. So we accounted for all that. Now, the the differences that you see regionally, so the Great Plains, I mentioned before, would have the biggest impact on rates. That's partly because they have a lot of wind, and so they benefit a lot from the tax credit, but it's not only to serve their demand, They have so much good wind and transmission available that they're also, with the tax credit, they're actually exporting to other states.
Right.
And the way those are all traditionally regulated rates, the way rate making works, they get a credit called off-system sales. Yeah, it's basically the export credit that to other states. That goes away without the tax credit. So their rates get concentrated from higher cost to serve them, plus losing that credit to other states. So that's the Great Plains. Parts of the West also have a lot of wind and would also suffer in a similar regard in the sort of Rocky Mountain states. Um, let's see. Now, the South that I mentioned has really good solar. They would lose a lot of solar investment. Their rate impacts would be moderate. We see rate impacts everywhere. It's just they vary. One place that would have fairly high rate impacts is states that have stringent clean energy goals. The idea there is they're going to meet, we assume they would meet them even at the higher cost. So they don't turn to some other resource and partly avoid the cost increase. And so we see big increases in California and the Northeast in rates.
Right.
Mid-Atlantic states, they're sort of much softer targets and they sort of veer away from them and their rate increases are moderate. Um, anyway, those are maybe that gives you a flavor.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I'd love to hone in a bit on different technologies and sort of pace of deployment right now. Um, when it comes to some of these chip fabs, they need 24/7 completely firm, reliable power. Um, and that's probably not going to be solar, but not necessarily going to be solar or wind. But at the same time, in the study, you found that solar and wind are actually much more quickly deployable than other potentially firm sources of power, like
And
gas or
storage, yeah, and
and
storage.
storage. And so I imagine there are a lot of folks out there thinking, is it that renewables are sort of an imperfect solution, or is it not a solution as we're trying to meet? Could you just talk about the different demand needs
Yeah.
and how pace of deployment and then firm versus intermittent plays in there as we're trying to meet this broad challenge of demand
Yeah.
growth?
Yeah, no, that question is right. So it is true that wind and solar are intermittent. They don't themselves provide firm. You need other resources. Um, and our study accounts for that. That's actually a topic that we're particularly expert in, is sort of how to manage a system so that it provides um, reliable power basically 100% of the time. And the way it works, it gets harder as if you wanted to rely on it entirely. But if it's part of the grid where you have existing gas-fired generation to back it up, you would also need new gas-fired generation to back it up. The storage is playing a big role in that. I mean, the sun goes down and demand is still high. That if it were on its own, that wouldn't work. But when it's combined with storage and it's part of this whole portfolio, they all have value. I mean, per megawatt of installed capacity, it's not as valuable for meeting new load. The wind and solar are not at, but it does as part of the portfolio add value. Just you just have to analyze it in a way that only counts it as insofar as it reliably helps as part of a portfolio.
Right. So, Rachel, I know you were talking about hydrogen, and this is sort of the use cases were outside of the scope of electricity generation, but obviously you guys work a lot on natural gas. And so,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, how are you thinking about uh, fossils' role in the context of this broader demand growth story, and now in the context of this sort of jump ball on energy tax credits that we are in the midst of right now?
Yeah, well, it's a good time to be in the natural gas business because there's a lot of supply and we see a ton of opportunities, obviously, with the AI load growth story. I mean, I think that you'd be remiss if you didn't hear what's going on at CERAWeek here and, all of these technologies from nuclear opportunities to, fill that demand to potentially natural gas paired with carbon capture. I, don't know if hydrogen fits entirely into the AI load growth story, but maybe, maybe to some extent, I do think power generation at some point would be an interesting kind of lane here for hydrogen. When the power plant rules were running, the Biden era power plant rules were going, these last few years, we were excited to see the potential demand that it could provide, that hydrogen could play there as well. But really from a natural gas perspective, we've seen some estimates just from the sheer volume of natural gas that this hydrogen market could induce from natural. I mean, we produce, what is it, 37 trillion cubic feet annually of natural gas. And some of the estimates we've seen here for what hydrogen could demand from natural gas would be, around 20 to 30% potentially. If we had a really robust hydrogen economy in the US, we could see this as a huge, huge new market for the natural gas space. And so that, if you do the math a little bit, maybe like 7 to 8 trillion cubic feet of additional natural gas production would go to producing hydrogen. And so that's one of the reasons why we see this as just so inherently compatible with the energy dominance agenda, coupling, obviously with our long history of carbon management. I think that there's a pretty strong argument there for, hey, we've got the resources, we have the assets. This is kind of the right time here from the perspective of we've really made so many advancements in the shale revolution that I don't think there's much concern about us not having the resource to both fulfill the AI load growth story while also contributing to a new market for hydrogen. We can do all of that, and I think that's why we're appreciative in a lot of senses of this administration recognizing that we can do that from the AI side. We just need to make sure they're on board for the hydrogen side as well here, because we don't want to be cutting off opportunities for new markets, especially those that can fill the dual role of reducing emissions at the same time exporting to our, allies abroad, and also, having the making the most of our existing assets, which I know, is a big priority for this administration.
Right. I mean, that's incredibly well said. And I think what has been frustrating about the conversation of this weird binary between renewables or fossil is
Yeah.
that has been sort of a frustrating binary. And the opportunity of this challenge um, is that we can move past that, right, and talk about the role of all different energy resources as we try to meet this challenge. And obviously, Conserve America is a conservation organization. Conservation environmentalism has long been uh, perhaps by some folks in that movement have sort of said that this is the absence of the utilization. We are not going to utilize our resources. That is the environmentally responsible thing to do. Whereas I think conservation in sort of the Teddy Roosevelt sense is the responsible development of resources and doing it in a way that is compatible with human flourishing, and also protecting and ensuring that future generations will get to enjoy the environment and resources and prosperity. And so I think that that's what's exciting about this moment,
Mhm.
whether it is, using carbon capture for enhanced oil recovery, or it's developing renewables on public lands. There's sort of a place for all of these different technologies. So with that, Sam, Rachel, I just want to see if either of you have any kind of final words for our audience on how to think about this jump ball moment when it comes to U.S. energy policy, as they're trying to figure out how we should go about this in a way that both unleashes human flourishing through abundant energy, but also is compatible with good environmental stewardship. Maybe Sam, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, focusing on, I mean, look, obviously the clean energy resources add to the supply and they don't emit. They also, especially if we start to develop some of the supply chains ourselves, there's no question these are very important resources for the future. And I mean, our study didn't even account for that, the sort of technology development, supply chain development aspects. But if the primary objective is, I think in the short run, it's especially to meet all this new demand reliably. And if you're going to do that, everybody I talk to in the electricity business recognizes you want to be able to make use of all these available resources. Every resource is challenging to permit, um, to plan, permit, construct, get the equipment for it, interconnect. It takes time. There's a lot of tightness in, say, in the gas-fired supply chain right now. This is a particularly important time to be enabling all these resource types and all these projects in development, which vastly dominate the development pipeline at the moment, that are wind and solar and storage. They've been counting on these tax credits. So the idea of it seems like it would be pretty disruptive to at this moment that coincides with having the highest demand growth we've ever had. It seems like it would be a pretty disruptive time to to change those terms so substantially.
Yeah, that's well taken, Sam. Rachel, I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, I hate to not be controversial because I love to be controversial, but I think I'm going to agree with you all in saying that I really think that we've been boxed into this concept that we need to be making choices between alternatives, but really I think that's just a false choice here. I mean, we can reshore manufacturing. We can ensure that the clean energy transition occurs with American jobs using American resources. We don't have to be choosing between climate objectives and national energy dominance objectives. This is all possible here. We just have to make sure we have the right kind of pieces in place to be able to seize this opportunity. I think the tax credits are absolutely, especially 45V and Q, are absolutely those critical pieces to ensure that we can do all of these things that pretty much across the board we want. I don't really see the 45V credit, for example, being really a value proposition issue. I think right now it's really just a political issue of who has the will to kind of stand up for some of these in the face of a very, very, chaotic political environment. So I think the value proposition, as I said, is it kind of speaks for itself to a certain extent. So let's all not get too bogged down with this kind of false choice that we feel we need to make when in reality we can do all of this.
Very well said. I don't know if there's much more I can add on top of that. Rachel, Sam, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me this afternoon, and thank you to everybody who tuned in. I hope this was a useful conversation at a very interesting and uncertain moment in American energy policy, and look forward to talking to you guys again soon.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.